Hi, everyone, and welcome to the PASS Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion virtual group. Today's session, Diversity, Equity, Inclusion, What's the Difference, is part 2 of a DEI Fundamentals series. This will be recorded and posted online. You will receive an email letting you know when a recording is available. My name is Denisha Malone. My pronouns are she, her, and hers, and I'm a co-leader of the DEI virtual group. I will be today's moderator. Please feel free to enter any questions and comments into the chat, and I will relay them throughout the presentation. I have a few intro slides before I hand over the reins to Andrea. This year, PASS will host their first ever PASS Virtual Summit next week on November 10th through the 13th. Head over to pass.org to register and learn more about this year's lineup. There are dozens of PASS virtual groups that cover a variety of topics for data professionals. Here are some upcoming webinars from these groups. You can connect with PASS online using your favorite social media platform. Today's speaker is Andrea Mascher. Andrea leads the SQL Server Database Administration team at the University of Iowa. Andrea is an advocate for gender diversity in STEM and co-founded Iowa's Women in Technology user groups to promote a climate of inclusivity and professional growth for women and non-binary individuals in technical fields at Iowa. Andrea is also a co-leader here at the PASS DEI virtual group. Without further ado, I'll hand things over to her.
Thanks, Denisha.
Thank you.
All right, thanks for joining today, everyone. I'm Andrea Mascher. My pronouns are she, her, and hers. And as Denisha mentioned, I lead the SQL Server DBA team at the University of Iowa. And I'm also a co-leader of the PASS DEI virtual group. PowerPoint auto captions have been enabled for this presentation, and I apologize for any funniness that it shows. Because it's embedded in PowerPoint, there's no way for you to disable the captions on your end of things. On September 22nd, 2020, the White House issued an executive order that prohibits grant-receiving institutions from providing training on certain facets of DEI. While I'm employed by the University of Iowa, I'm coming to you today as an independent private speaker, and I do not represent the university. Just like technology, DEI is a constantly changing topic. I try my best to use appropriate and respectful language, but my understanding about this can be very incomplete. If I say anything incorrect or harmful, I ask that you let me know so that I can avoid doing it in the future. Since this is part 2 of a DEI Fundamentals series, let's start by going over a couple of key concepts from part 1. Identity is the main focus of the last session, and it's just simply belonging to a group. It's a foundational concept in DEI because you need to understand identity before you can see how it impacts lived experiences. And differences in experiences is why we have to be mindful of having better DEI practices. Everyone has multiple identities. For example, I'm biracial, I'm a woman, I'm a DBA, I'm a PASS virtual group co-leader. These things mean very different things depending on the context. Intersectionality is related to identity, and it refers to how identities combine together to make each person's experience unique. There are many, many things that go into being a good ally. The most important thing, though, is taking active ownership and working to reduce oppression for people who have lacked the resources or benefits that you have. All right, so let's start with belonging and a little bit of a metaphor or story. Let's say that you are visiting a friend at their home and they're really, really proud of their space. Your friend answers the door and is wearing these really cute bunny slippers. But they ask you to remove your shoes. So you walk around the house and you're barefoot, and that's okay normally, but what happens if the floor isn't very smooth? What You might get splinters in your feet. And sometimes it's really surprising how much a tiny little splinter can hurt so much. You definitely can't walk around the house easily with splinters in your feet. You need to stop and take care of it, take it off. But maybe you just deal with it silently and you don't say anything to your host. So you're continuing to check out the house, walk around, and your friend says, "Isn't my house super duper nice?" And you might say, "Sure, it's a beautiful home, but it isn't really comfortable for me to be here." And they say, "What's the problem?" Oops. So you show them your foot and you say, "Check it out. Your floors are cutting up my feet. I can barely walk 10 feet without having to stop and deal with this." Your friend might say, I don't know what you're talking about. I've lived here for years. I've never experienced that. There must be something wrong with your feet. They must be extra sensitive." So let's reflect on that story. What what is the host experiencing in this situation? They've been wearing slippers this whole time, and sure, maybe they replace them every once in a while, but they're comfortable wearing them all the time in their home, so they never notice the problem with their floors. This is where some of us are when it comes to DEI, and if not the people who are watching this webinar today, some of the people who are around us. On the flip side, what are you experiencing as a guest? Even if your host is otherwise extremely kind and gracious, you can't really spend a lot of time here without experiencing some sort of harm. This is not a space where you feel like you belong. We work on diversity, equity, and inclusion, or DEI, to make sure that everyone feels like they belong. But what do these terms really mean? Let's start with diversity, which is the most familiar term in DEI. It refers to having differences represented in a setting. For example, an ecosystem can have a diversity of species. A wardrobe can have a diversity of clothing brands or styles. A group of people can have a diversity of experiences or opinions. Data people really love the concept of diversity because it's a quantitative thing. It's something we can count. It should be noted, however, that diversity is a concept that can only exist in relationship to others. A specific person is not diverse. That person is a unique individual. A group of people can be diverse. A person can bring diversity into a group, but that doesn't make them a diverse person. Diversity is an important first step, but it's not sufficient to create a culture of belonging, which is why inclusion and equity come into the picture. Renee Myers says, diversity is being invited to the party, and inclusion is being asked to dance. In other words, diversity is about representation, while inclusion is about involvement. Inclusive practices empower individuals to participate without feeling like they have to ask for some sort of special accommodation. The cool thing is you can always be inclusive regardless of how much diversity is present in a given moment. One example of inclusive practices is what is often called the Pac-Man Rule. People in a group having a big group conversation will often form into a circle so that everyone can see each other and make eye contact. We typically leave that circle completely enclosed. So when I'm at a party and I want to join in because that conversation seems pretty interesting, there are a couple of options for me. I can try to squeeze in. I can hover and wait for somebody else to leave and then quickly grab their spot. Or I can kind of try to flag down the attention of someone who's already in that group so that they will invite me in. All three of these are really awkward and uncomfortable for me. So the Pac-Man rule recommends that you always leave a gap in that conversation circle. which sort of looks like Pac-Man, which is why it's called that. This way, someone can join into the conversation without much fuss. And then when that circle closes up because of that new person, everyone takes a step back and makes a new gap so another person can join. Being in a circle with a little gap doesn't change the quality of your conversation for the people who are already in it, but it does provide an opportunity for someone new to join without having to ask for it. Without expressing it with words, this is a simple act that makes the environment of conversation and dialogue more inclusive. Obviously, these days, it's harder to exercise this practice with social distancing, but you can apply it as an analogy in how you engage with other people virtually. Equity is about making sure that everyone has what they need to be successful. Door-to-door trick-or-treating isn't an option for all kids, for example, those with mobility issues. There are ways to do this, though, without traveling long distances or having to go up flights of stairs over and over again. For example, hosting a Halloween party or doing a trunk or treat in a parking lot. When we do this, kids and their families can still celebrate, even if they couldn't participate in the typical door-to-door way. What's needed for success is always going to be based on somebody's existing experiences. Some people like to say, I treat everyone equally, and this is not the same thing as equity. In the story of David and Goliath, equality would occur if both David and Goliath were given a slingshot. Equity is evening the odds and giving slingshots to the person that is not a giant. These images are a metaphor for the difference between the concepts. So we've got 3 children who are trying to watch a baseball game. In the image on the left, each child gets exactly 1 box to boost them up and see over the fence. That is equality. The issue here is that the ground these boxes are on are at different elevations, which could represent historical barriers. Also, the fence is at different heights, and that might represent present-day barriers. And then finally, the 3rd child made a little hole in the fence, and that kind of symbolizes the way that sometimes people find workarounds to get what they need. In the image on the right, each child gets the number of boxes they need to see over the fence. This is what equity is. In a perfect world, there wouldn't be a fence. The ground would be flat. No one would need a box to stand on, and everyone could just watch the game. If we lived in a perfect world, we could treat everyone equally. Equity is about making things more fair in a world that isn't perfect. The term privilege is really controversial, has a lot of baggage. And people mistakenly believe that suggesting you have privilege means that you didn't earn your accomplishments. And so when someone hears that, it's totally understandable to feel defensive or frustrated if that's what you think the word means. But that's not really what privilege is about. Privilege is the benefit someone gets because they're part of an identity group. People who are not in that identity group don't get that benefit by default. To be clear, people in the privileged group aren't necessarily doing anything active or intentional to get that benefit. That's just the status quo. Going back to the concept of intersectionality, we all have multiple identities, and some of them are going to give us an advantage, and some of them will be a disadvantage for us. Acknowledging the areas where we do have privilege does not negate the struggles we have from the places where we don't. Our experience of privilege or lack of privilege really depends on the context. Privilege is relative. So let's think back to the story of hardwood floors that we discussed a little earlier. This home is very cozy for the host. Their privilege is having their own slippers. They've lived here for years, and wearing those slippers is so automatic, they didn't even realize that the floor has splinters. That doesn't make them a bad person. They don't need to feel guilty that millions of people have never even heard of slippers before. And slippers are not appropriate or necessary in all situations. I would very much prefer being barefoot at the beach than wearing slippers. It's pretty annoying to remove sand from regular shoes. I imagine fluffy slippers would be even worse. But in the context of this home, feet need some sort of protection. So when the host says, I don't know what you're talking about, my feet have never gotten injured here, they aren't doing a good job of recognizing their privilege. If they respond to this by keeping some spare slippers or thick socks for guests, this might be them recognizing their privilege and trying to do something that makes things more equitable. Maybe the host was brought up that they always wear slippers in their house. And if you were the first guest to visit, there was no way for them to know that this was an issue. The whole point of having privilege is that you aren't doing anything out of the ordinary to get it. It doesn't automatically make you a bad person if you have it and you never even knew. So when someone does point out your privilege, what they're really trying to do is this. They want you to be open to the idea that you've been taking for granted something that other people just haven't had the same access to. Then they want you to try and understand how having that thing makes things easier for them, and not having that thing makes things a little harder for others. And then finally, when you can, they want you to reduce the inequities when it's in your power to do so, that you try to help out and even the playing field. So to summarize, diversity is about representation, inclusion is about participation, and equity is about addressing barriers. To create a culture of belonging, we really need all of them working together. Before I move on to the next section, are there any questions, Tanisha? I'm going to mute and adjust my headset.
No, there are not any questions yet.
My headset keeps on falling off my head. All right. All right, since this is a past virtual group, I want to bring this back a little bit into how we work with data. So to start off, let's do a quick visual test. You don't need to reply in the chat, but take a moment to think about this. Which line appears the longest and which one appears the shortest? Some of you might already recognize this test as the Müller-Lyer illusion. In fact, each of these lines are the same length. Even when we are aware of this illusion and can prove that they're the same length, we're still going to perceive the lengths as different. So let's go back to that original standalone image. Now that we know that they're the same length, but they still look different to me. Bias is an inclination to have pros or cons towards something, and it influences us daily. We don't know its exact origin. It can be formed out of cognition or through the specific context you're in. It's something that can be innate, or it's something that can be learned. Our decisions, reactions, and interpretations form the context of the origin of our bias. So we see this in action when we're thinking about how we connect with people. We either actively seek out or avoid people based on things like genetics, interests, past experiences, and a lot of other reasons. For every interest we share, there's going to be an opposite of that spectrum of not sharing that interest. That creates an in-group and an out-group based on our preferences and social identities. Using the optical illusion as an example is helpful to understand some of the nuances of bias. So first, bias is pervasive, and we all have biases. In the optical illusion, we can mentally remind ourselves that the lines are the same length, but we really can't unsee them as different. Second, knowing that we have bias might make us feel a little bit uncomfortable. But that's because we have a bias against the word bias. It often has negative connotations and is associated with things like stereotyping. Bias is really our brains trying to simplify the world. The optical illusion was caused by our brain trying to make some guesses about the line length based on the context of the arrow direction. Similarly, we make assumptions or judgments based on the context of individuals, as well as the people we associate with them. This isn't to say that having a bias is good, but rather that we need to become aware of our biases so that we can counteract them. It's worth noting that unconscious bias and implicit bias are terms that are often used interchangeably, but they are subtly different. Unconscious bias is those that we're unaware of, things that are outside of our control and occur when we haven't made associations to identify the cause of an action or a thought. Implicit bias are the biases that become ingrained or automatic. As you build awareness of your biases, moving from a state of unconscious to conscious, what you'll find is that even though you're aware, you might still have the same instinctive or gut reaction that causes judgments. You may or may not be aware of your implicit bias, but only by becoming aware of it can you know how to suppress or counteract or compensate for it. In the case of the illusion, an unconscious bias was formed when the first time we saw the illusion, making the lines look like they were different lengths. We persisted an implicit bias when we continued to see the lengths as different, even though we know otherwise. The topic of bias is a challenge because it overlaps with what I like to call the isms, racism, sexism, ageism. There is a relationship between them, and it's important to understand how they influence one another. Bias is about an individual's tendency as it comes from a wide range of influences, either cognitive or from your society. The isms are a form of cultural bias generated based on how we perceive otherness and social identities that aren't our own. This goes back to the concept that biases are about in and out groups. So prejudice or prejudgment comes from our own individual social, cultural context. Having a bias is not going to make you a ist or ism on your own, but you will accidentally form various ist tendencies based on your group identification. So a bias that I've already demonstrated using the optical illusion is something called ableism. In order to effectively use that visual aid, I made an assumption that everyone here has a typical range of vision, either naturally or corrected. This analogy would be lost for someone who has a visual impairment. But that's not part of my identity, so it's really easy to overlook that and not think about how the difficulties they have will change how they experience this learning medium. So next, let's take some time to understand how bias relates to data. In computer science, a familiar phrase is garbage in, garbage out. We've spent some time discussing how bias is ingrained socially. Now we're going to talk about how bias has unintentionally fed into how we're using data. So to paraphrase, bias in and bias out. Sampling bias is a limitation of your data based on the populations you're using. This can be deliberate by choosing your population, but can also be applied implicitly. The bias presents itself in machine learning through what training sets you use. Joy Biulomwini from the MIT Media Lab has researched this in her study Gender Shades. Her study found bias in prominent image recognition software, specifically for darker-skinned women. While the mask she holds in this image was recognized by these machine learning systems, her face was left undetectable. After some companies adjusted their software, the suggestion then became a person wearing sunglasses. This is an improvement, but it's still problematic because it makes the assumption that lenses darker than their frames means sunglasses, instead of understanding that darkness can be a natural skin attribute. As data practitioners, we can be proactive about this. We can think critically about our data sources. A good question to ask yourself is, what populations are missing from these data? Reporting bias is the act of featuring or suppressing your data results. In dashboard design, we're encouraged to reduce clutter because the brain can only process so much data at once. This is Charles Joseph Maynard's infographic about Napoleon's march and retreat from Moscow. It's pretty famous, I guess, to data visualization people. What it does is it shows a timeline of events and the path of the army's march. It also shows the size of the army and the temperature over that same time. It is highly celebrated because of the story it tells. But there are some questions that it doesn't answer. Where were these events in relation to country borders? Would that have an impact on allyship or allegiance? What else do we know about the fights beyond the date, location, and France's army size? And what was Maynard's intention of creating this visualization? For our work, how we decide what or what is not important can go into what we put into our data visualization. So we really need to ask ourselves what data is or should be tracked. Anchoring bias is relying too heavily on one attribute to make your decisions. In research, the anchoring biases are addressed by recognizing that the potential for confounding variables that weren't measured or couldn't be controlled, can still nevertheless impact the results of a study. How anchoring bias presents itself internally is in stereotype threat, which is the conflict of conforming to a stereotype about our own social groups. For example, a common stereotype is that women are worse at math than men, and studies have shown that being primed or reminded about one's gender will cause women to perform worse than men on tests. With no priming or an explicit reminder that for this test, gender has no impact, women perform just as well, if not better, than men. Similar results have been seen when being primed about one's race or ethnicity and intersectionality. It's easier to anchor in order to make a more generalizable results. It makes things quicker, but it is not fully characteristic of the complexity of experiences, perceptions, influences, or attributes. You can't use only one feature to know the truth. There are tons of other types of biases, and I encourage you to do some research as you think critically about your work and the data you work with. A couple of quick examples: affinity bias. That's the tendency to get along with people that we like or have a connection with. And conversely, it causes issues in our relationships for people who are not the same as us, that are dissimilar. In terms of data, this might present itself in how much we might weigh the influence of something in our data. Unconsciously, we're more likely to accept the opinions of those that are more similar to us. So with this, we need to understand what steps we can take to address these biases. So first is to address bias in the data itself. So we need to understand bias. So the questions to ask are, who or what is generating and collecting the data? Can bias within our environment influence the work as a whole? Who or what is in the data population? How did we decide what to include and how did we decide what to exclude? Are there limitations because the method we used to retrieve or store or present the data? In mitigating bias, we think about the flow of data and opportunities where corrections can occur. So, are we correcting during a post-processing phase where we establish our baselines for data confidence and then correct for errors after the fact? Are we correcting during the in-processing stage, intentionally building models or generating classifications that address the biases that we are aware of? Or are we correcting during a pre-processing stage by reducing our bias through data selection or how various factors are weighted? As we're thinking about how we can make the data itself less biased, we can simultaneously talk about how we ourselves can become less biased. Many organizations have published guidelines and resources. When you're thinking about ethics, consider where are your data coming from, how are they being used, and the impact of reporting the data. When you're thinking about inclusive design, focus on employing empathy and try to use accessibility checklists and other frameworks. So before I move on to the next section, are there any questions, Denisha?
No questions.
Cool. All right, let's move on to some patterns of workplace bias. So prove it again is a bias pattern that refers to the fact that groups are stereotyped as less competent often have to do things to prove themselves over and over again. A saying that sums it up pretty well is Ginger Rogers had to do everything that Fred Astaire had to do, but backwards and in high heels. This pattern usually occurs because of affinity bias. When you have incomplete information about someone else, it's a lot easier to fill in the blanks with positive information when they're like you. And when they aren't like you, it's harder to do that. It's either easier to fill in the blanks with negative stereotypes or just to be generally cautious. People subject to prove it again biases are more likely to be judged based on past performance, while people in a dominant identity might be given the benefit of the doubt, judged on potential. For some of these groups, successes are more likely to be attributed to luck, not skill. Mistakes are noticed more, they're remembered longer, and the same error for another person might be treated as a one-off and quickly dismissed. Oftentimes, objective rules and requirements are applied more rigorously to people in these groups and more leniently to others. The tightrope acknowledges that the range of acceptable or expected workplace behavior is a lot narrower for women and people of color than it might be for somebody from a more dominant identity. A dynamic that's often cited for high-profile women is that it's difficult to be both liked and respected. Being more of one will make you less of the other. This push and pull is why the pattern is called the tightrope. So we see this sometimes in how we describe the same behavior in different people. When someone changes their mind, are they being agile or is that being erratic? When someone clearly states what they think, do you consider that being direct, or does that make them abrasive? As we consider this bias, we should think about how gender and race might play into the terms we tend to use to describe others. The parental wall impacts parents of all genders and employees that don't have children. So for fathers, there's an expectation that they won't or shouldn't take time off to take care of their kids. They might get preferences when it comes to promotion or increased pay because they have a family to support. On the flip side, mothers are often stereotyped to be more likely to need time to take care of the kids. This can be held against them, and they might be held to higher performance or punctuality standards. Sometimes stretch assignments are withheld because there's an assumption that they don't, or at least shouldn't, want to take on new responsibilities at work. Mothers that do work a lot might be disliked because there's an assumption that to work so hard means that you aren't a good parent. And then finally, for people who don't have kids, there's an assumption that they can pick up the slack of the parents because they don't have a life, they don't have responsibilities. Because of COVID, many employers have been forced to permit flexibility that didn't exist before. So some questions we need to ask as this continues is flexibility uniformly being implemented? Can everyone receive it, or is it only for people with specific circumstances? Are people going to be penalized in the future because they're leveraging flexibility today? Finally, the tug of war is about how external biases impact how people in underrepresented groups treat one another. So one example would be the competition you see from tokenism. When there are pride's diversity positions, and those are just there to meet compliance quotas, people might need to compete with one another to get those spots. If there's only limited space at the top, there's going to be a disincentive to help each other succeed. Another way that this shows up is strategic distancing. Sometimes people from underrepresented groups try to distance themselves from others who have the same identity as they do so that they can be more like the cool group, the in group. When Marissa Mayer was the VP at Google, she was often quoted as saying, "I'm not a girl at Google, I'm a geek at Google." To learn more about these patterns of bias in the workplace, I suggest that you check out biasinterrupters.org. When it comes to performance feedback, the key is to frequently ask yourself, am I really being consistent? So when it comes to time to introduce organizational change to where you're at, we want to be data-driven. So places that you can look for patterns are in how people are hired, how work is assigned, what happens during performance evaluations, and how compensation is determined. For example, you might look at how assignments are distributed. Make a list of low-profile tasks, list A, and high-profile tasks, list B, and see how much time, what ratio of time different employees spend on each. Are assignments the same and different before and after parental leave or other life changes? As data people, we should remember that what gets measured gets done. So before I move on to inclusive practices, are there any questions or comments in the chat?
No, no questions or comments.
Cool, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
So there are a lot of different ways to learn more about your biases. The Harvard Implicit Association test takes about 10 minutes, and it's really revealing, or it has been for me. There are excellent free resources online, and you can find it in whatever format you prefer. There are articles, books, podcasts, videos, whatever you like. If you want to work on this with a group, maybe your friends or your peers, look for an equity challenge, because these will provide resource lists and, questions and comments to keep the conversation going. Finally, you can look for paid workshops or other formal training. What I recommend is see what's going on at a local higher ed institution, or local nonprofits, or churches and religious institutions are doing a lot of this these days. So there are a lot of style guides and resources to make your language more inclusive. The root of many of these is to apply empathy. We often hear about the golden rule: treat others the way that you want to be treated. Instead, let's think about the platinum rule: treat others the way they want you to treat them. Remember that things that seem pretty innocuous to you can be really hurtful to others. So here's a few simple lists, quick substitutions that you might want to try to apply into your language these days. They tend to cluster around gender, orientation, ability, and race. This is a constantly moving target, and I'm still working on these things. Ableism has been the hardest for me because I use things so much as metaphors. And I like to use big language, like calling something that is exceptional or surprising crazy. So don't beat yourself up if you can't do it right away. Just try to make progress. So climate is what you expect, while weather is what you get. Today is November 5th, and I live in Iowa. We had our first snow about 2 weeks ago. There were about 2 inches. And I expect it to be cold here for most of the next few months. So that's climate. But today, the high temperature is going to be 70 degrees or 21 Celsius. And that's weather. We can use a similar analogy when we're talking about climate in an organization. There's going to be one-off experiences that are good, one-off experiences that are bad, but climate is about the perception of what a typical day is going to be like. So things to think about are policies, those, the formal rules that are in writing. Thinking about fit, which has to do with the informal rules, the way that things get done. Customs are about the practices that you do. And amplification is being aware of whose perspective is respected and is getting reinforced, while interruption is focusing on whose perspective is getting negated or ignored. So when we're thinking about meetings, particularly in the workplace, we want to be really deliberate. Think about who's in the meeting, who's missing, how you do that, set some ground rules, what you do, how do you make people feel welcome during the meeting. So you want to focus on being mindful of what the experience is like, and then once the meeting is over, reflect on how it went and how you can do better next time. When it comes to communicating, so presentations like this today, or emails or other forms of communication, there are a variety of tactical approaches to consider. So when it comes to accessibility, you can do things like adding live closed captions or putting image descriptions, thinking about color, contrast, font in your emails. In Microsoft products, there is a check accessibility feature for Office. When it comes to cultural awareness, you can use those style guides that I referred to previously. It's really important to check your assumptions. Lots of different people are going to have different experiences. It's not uncommon for someone to tell a story or an anecdote that the audience can't relate to at all. It has nothing to do with their lived experience. And then finally, within Office, under the grammar settings, there is an inclusiveness feature, which will give you little squiggly lines, just like when you use bad grammar in your email or Word document. Another thing to think about is learning styles. So there's spatial, which is about observing things, where pictures, images, diagrams are helpful. Auditory, that's good for people who prefer lectures or speeches. People who are linguistic really want things to be expressed in speech or in writing. Kinesthetic learners are going to learn best when they can do rather than see or hear. Logical learners really want to understand the reasoning behind what you're teaching them, apply a scientific method. Social learners find it easier when they can work with others to learn something, and solitary learners prefer to do things alone. We're all a combination of these things, but understanding what is most helpful to others makes your message get across much better. Related to this is universal design for learning is thinking about how you frame a subject can make it more salient, more important to someone. So engagement, kind of ask the question, why? Who cares about this thing? Why should I do what you're talking about? Representation is really about the what, using analogies and metaphors. It's about really understanding what's going on. And then action, expression is very much about how. How do I implement this now that I know about it? How can I measure it after the fact? How can I make my boss really proud that I've learned this thing? People have different values when it comes to these things, and framing your conversation can really make a huge difference here. So events, since Summit is coming up next week, professional events outside of the workplace, like conferences, we need to really consider some extra things, because there's this combination of official and non-official, or formal, and informal. So social events add this fluidity to how people feel like they can engage. Things to consider are what works for attendees. And you can do this by making sure that attendees are properly represented in the people who are planning the event. But some other things to consider are things like alcohol, because a lot of people don't want to consume it, or it can cause people to maybe make unwise decisions. Thinking about the timing and scheduling. People who have families or other responsibilities might not be able to attend an event if it's at, in the evening. And it's really important to be data driven. After you have an event, try to get feedback and use that as an input into your next event. When you're networking with others, a good question to ask yourself are there gaps? What social identities are missing in my circle? Another thing when you're talking to someone or building a relationship is to think about their style, what works for them. So what is a good contact from an introvert's perspective is going to be very different for an extrovert. An introvert really wants time to observe, to think, to reflect on stuff, while an extrovert really wants to dive into the problem, really think out loud as they solve, and have a lot of options. Another way to think about this is languages of appreciation. Different things are important to another when you are showing that you value them. So time, spending quality time with someone might be useful. Getting a gift, being told that someone did a good job doing acts of service. Some of these mean more than the other, and that really can impact whether or not they understand that you value them. Finally, it's really a good idea to do what you can to show that you are trying to create a safe space for everyone and that you respect them. So for example, for LGBT people, I think it's a good practice to include your pronouns when you're introducing yourself or in your email signature, because that shows that it's something that you care about, you're trying to understand. The more vulnerability and openness we can show, the better. And, just apply typical common sense, emotional intelligence practices. So to wrap up, when we encounter conflict, it's really easy to convert or persuade someone who's on the other side. When you meet someone new, really accept them for who they are. Try to accept that their experiences, opinions, talents are going to be theirs and theirs alone and not the same as yours. Once you master accepting what is, it's really amazing how quickly you can move to understanding. And as you understand other perspectives, it's a lot easier to find ways to ensure that everyone feels like they belong, which is really, once again, the end goal of DEI. So I really want to thank everyone today for joining me on your DEI journey. And now, are there any questions?
No, no questions. Does anyone have any questions?
So here's my contact information, and we've got a few minutes, so I will stay on the line in case there are any questions or comments.
We have a question here from Jess. He has a comment. He says, amazing session, great work in breaking down those topics. We really appreciate it. Yes, it was a really great session.
Really appreciate that.
Question. What is from Lashana Lewis? What is the hardest thing that folks experience with addressing internalized oppression?
Just that easy question, huh? For me, and internalize. I'm guessing that this is kind of associated with things like imposter syndrome, and when you say internalized oppression, so kind of pushing these negative cultural things about your identity onto yourself. I think what's been really helpful for me is what's sometimes called like making a posse or making a squad. I think surrounding yourself with people who can really remind you that your feelings about this are not the reality, that you are better than you might be telling yourself in the moment, that having a good network, having really good resources is really critical to catch yourself and to find ways to address it as well. I think as you're talking to these people, you might brainstorm things that you can do in a bigger scale, outside of yourself. And I find that that's really empowering for me, thinking about how I can help others, not just help myself when it comes to the oppression I experience.
That was a really good answer. Really good question.
Well, thank you. if there is nothing else, I will wrap up. So we are on Twitter, so feel free to reach out to us there if you want to ask us a question offline. And we're really looking forward to building up DEI in the data community. And as we get more and more resources and get this group moving, I don't want to speak for you, Denisha, but I'm really excited about the things that we can do to address the things that have been hard for certain people in the community.
Yes, that's mutual.
So we're really enjoying that we get to be part of this journey and this transformation for PASS. All right. Well,
so I wanted to share a piece of news.
Go ahead.
Next week, we did mention a PASS summit. It's going to be next week. There's a panel discussion on the 12th that I'm a part of for diversity in tech for the professional woman. So if you're a woman and you're in IT and you're going to the PASS summit, then make sure you check out that panel discussion.
And then also this year is having the first, in addition to the Women in Technology keynote, there will also be a DEI keynote. And I'm really excited about the speaker. I've read some stuff by her and she's really cool. And I think she has a lot of good stuff to say. So I hope everyone that is going to Summit can join in on that.
Yeah, that would be great.
All right. Well, let's wrap things up and give some people 2 minutes of their day back.
Yes, thank you.
All right. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.